Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Disclosure, Energy. Okay, Disclosure, Guy and Howard Lawrence. This is their third album, and I have done videos on their previous two albums, though the Caracol video is from 2015, first year that I was doing reviews, and as such I find it to be pretty much entirely unwatchable, but as some recap, I have been following these guys since their debut album, Settle, dropped in 2013 and was a big hit. That was back when I was first starting to feel like I need to keep up more with what's currently popular in the electronic music world rather than just spend all my time on older artists. Though, at the time, I was not particularly impressed by Settle. At the time, I thought it was quite boring and didn't really do anything I hadn't heard before out of other artists and adjacent scenes. Even if back then a lot of my exposure to their brand of deep house was mostly relegated to, like, early period Cascade. But as the years went by, that album gradually got better and better. I ended up enjoying basically every track on there, and I now view it as pretty rock solid across the board, to the point of including it in that Best Albums of the Decade video. I really appreciate how it created this big resurgence of deep house music and even brought it into the mainstream. Though, even to this day, I still view it as, like, a band showing a lot of potential. Like, yeah, this is great, but I still really think they have something in them that's even better. Like, they could put out a truly incredible house album if they put their mind to it. Now, their follow-up, Caracol, turned out to not be that. It kind of showed them trying to double down on the stuff that got them popular in the mainstream, pull in bigger names like The Weeknd and Lorde and Miguel. The generally thicker production and more R&B heavy focus was kind of nice, but that album was also very inconsistent. Now, the stretch of the first four tracks still totally holds up as great, but after that it deflates quickly and becomes kind of samey and boring in one note, only saved by one track exclusive to the deluxe edition called Bang That. Now, hearing some of the stranger moments on these albums and some of their one-off singles had me wondering, what if they just made an album that leaned away from their poppier side? Wouldn't it be great if they just made a no-nonsense house album that didn't rely too much on guest features? In 2018, it looked like they were interested in going that direction when they dropped the Moonlight EP, which I admittedly barely registered as an EP at all at the time because they first released it as 5 disconnected singles. But that EP was freaking great. The way they worked in all these old samples from different eras of time and really fleshed out their sound into jazzier and funkier territory, touching on a bunch of different genres and combining them with their typical house sound. These samples ended up making this their most, like, instrumentally rich set of tracks up to that point. It kind of blew me away, and I was like, hell yeah, let's get a whole album of this stuff now. And nothing came of it. We did get to hear them hit the pop charts again when they produced the Khalid track, Talk, which became a massive hit throughout the entire year. But that track was not actually good. Like, the groove was unstable to the point of nausea-inducing, and even kind of aped off of That's What I Like by Bruno Mars without feeling clever or even fully intentional. It felt like an album's deep cut at best, and not something designed for the insane radio overplay that it got. The other track they did with Khalid later, Know Your Worth, that was significantly better and more Disclosure-y, but honestly just kind of forgot it existed after a while. But then they fully rekindled that hype once again by dropping another EP earlier this year called Ecstasy. And yes, that was this year, but that was also February, so, you know, like a century ago. But yeah, it was just as good, if not even better than the Moonlight EP. Maybe not as thematically focused or cohesive, but the 5 tracks on there were all among the best I've ever heard from them. Super punchy and sonically varied. The title track creating a super funky and immediately gripping groove. There were some kind of African-inspired tracks in Tondo and Atron that were pretty creative. The former of those a really neat disco fusion as well. Get Close was a spiritual sequel to Bang That, which was roughly equally as fun, and Expressing What Matters based itself entirely around a sample of Boz Skaggs' Lowdown, a track I already loved before, and getting the usual Disclosure twist. And they just freaking knocked it out of the park. But again, at the end of it all I could say was, okay, now give us a whole album of this stuff. I love it, but 5 tracks is just not enough. So then they finally announced this third album, dropping a bunch of singles like the title track and Douha, Mali Mali, and My High, which I mostly stay away from for the sake of not further spoiling myself, save for some previews they posted on Twitter and stuff. But the little bits that I did hear all banged. This album looks super tight and to the point, only 11 tracks, their shortest album to date. I was really excited for this one. The album was still loaded with guest features: Khalees, Amine, Slow Time, Mick Jenkins, Kalani, Sid, Common, etc., which was a little worrying. Like, okay, it looks like they're not making that more experimental turn that I always wanted them to make, but still, I had no reason to doubt them given how great the last two EPs were, and it was nice to have the whole Ecstasy EP in the same package for the deluxe edition as like a safety net in a worst case scenario. Surely this album would be great with their reputation of putting out great house music having been so well cemented now. Maybe this could even top Settle. Did that happen? Almost? Well, I'll tell you what, there's a version of this album that is definitely better than Settle. If you attach this album to the Ecstasy EP like the deluxe edition, but specifically put the EP first and the standard album second, and no more bonus tracks, then yes, the resulting album is basically Disclosure finally starting to tap into their full potential. That would in fact beat out Settle in my eyes. The standard edition of Energy by itself, it's definitely very close to Settle. It's about equally consistent from a track-by-track basis. But first of all, it is really stylistically scattershot and incohesive. I mean, generally I do prefer projects that have more variety like this one over something like Caracal where things just start to run together. But you do still gotta get the pacing right, and this one didn't quite flow together as well as I'd like. Also, I feel like it's lacking a big signature standout track that really defines it. Like, there's no When a Fire Starts to Burn, or a Latch, or Help Me Lose My Mind, or Omen, or Nocturnal that just really sticks out in that way. Again, if you add the Ecstasy EP on the front, this will fix the latter issue. You then get the first 3 tracks of that EP, which will easily serve that purpose, and even do it better than that last album. It'll also be better paced, it'll make the interludes feel like they fit in better. And it's also gotta be on the front and not the back. While just going the deluxe version route by sticking it on the end also makes the album better for the reasons I just mentioned, it doesn't do that job as effectively and kinda takes a bit of the punch out of the EP. Also, Get Close does not make for a very good closer. Going from that track into Watch Your Step is actually a really good transition that makes the album feel like, oh, it's having a second wind or something, kicking into gear again when you thought it was going to start to wind down a little. And then the combo of Birthday and Reverie, I think that makes for a more satisfying finish. Ecstasy followed by Energy also adds up to a little over an hour, only about 5 minutes longer than Settle. Perfectly acceptable length for an album, doesn't drag, is really well paced and varied. It's almost like the perfect Disclosure album that delivers everything I'd want out of a new project of theirs. But okay, I do have to review the Energy album purely on its own merits. And while it's not as great by itself, a little sloppily constructed, it's still like all hits with pretty much no misses. I have had listens of this thing where I was like, I don't know, this isn't really hitting the way I hoped it would. Though I think that was more just me not being in the right mood for it. By the next listen, I would be into it again, no problem. It's just really freaking good across the board. So let's get into individual tracks. Watch Your Step with Khalees is our opener. Great freaking track, starting with a cut that has just as much propulsive and danceable energy as you'd want. Really good hooks too. You make me watch your step when you move. Cool to see them properly working with Khalees after sampling her on Second Chance on their debut. That said, something about this track makes it feel like a bit of a weird pick for an opener. Like, it does take a little bit for the proper groove to really kick into gear. The first few bars have a bit of a thumping but sluggish beat that doesn't quite inspire the same hype that the rest of the track does. That's why I'm so hard set on it working better as track 6 directly following the EP. I think it needed to lead out of something to hit in the best possible way. The way it currently is, it's like if you started Settle with White Noise. Like, this is certainly not the worst opener you could have gone with, but I don't know, just something about it doesn't really scream album opener material. Anyway, next we got Lavender with Kennel Trace, and on first 2 listens of this thing, this was probably my least favorite. I thought the groove was a little jerky and repetitive. Also probably went on a minute longer than it needed to. That said, this track has also been a major grower as well. It really started to fit in with how hard its surrounding tracks go, and Kennel Trace really gets into this groove's pocket super smoothly. With enough repeat listens, I just kind of stopped caring about a lot of my initial issues. Still not a huge favorite, but definitely a lot of fun. And then My High with Amine and Slow Time. Man, that one goes incredibly hard. The single track that just most embodies the album's title. Both rappers are a great fit for this percussive instrumental, even when you wouldn't necessarily expect them to be. They get it to move faster than any other track here. Even when everything just, like, dies down to a whisper near the end, they just bring it right back up to speed. Though we do hit a low point after that with Who Knew with Mick Jenkins. That one's a bit of a more chill track that wouldn't feel out of place on Caracol, and, well, it surprisingly does not actually deflate the momentum the project had going up to that point. It's perfectly fine for what it is. Probably would have even been one of the better cuts had it been on their last album. But it is rather forgettable and not a track that ever really stuck out to me. Often passed by me super quick without leaving any impression. It's cool, I don't skip it just doesn't really stand out. But thankfully, that one, which is probably the album's weakest and most forgettable track, is followed up with undoubtedly its strongest and most memorable cut, Douha Mali Mali with Fatoumata Diawara. Sorry for butcher pronunciation as per usual. Not actually the first time they've worked together. Forgot to mention they did a one-off single in 2018 called Ultimatum. That was also really good and had some cool jazzy flares. Though this one's definitely catchier. This track is so uplifting and sunny and mood-brightening, and Diawara's presence really gives the track that interesting flavor to set itself apart from anything else here. Really sticks in the head, too. Could theoretically be a more effective opener than Watch Your Step, though it would also be much less indicative. It's fine where it is. So that's all great, though I'm told after this is a point at which the album seems to have lost some people and trailed off. A lot of people really like the first half of this thing and not so much the second. Personally, I'm not really sure what's so much worse about the second half. I mean, sure, the stuff beyond this point doesn't go as hard or have as much percussive energy as the stuff in the first half, but I don't think the album falls off after this at all. First of all, they do slip in one more big banger near the end with a title track. They once again sample the vocals of Eric Thomas, as they did on When a Fire Starts to Burn. And while no, it's not better than that track, it's different enough that it doesn't feel like it's laying in that track's shadow. Kind of like how Omen is not better than Latch, but it's still great on its own merits. Eric Thomas this time feels less like a sampled hook and more like this track's hype man. Like, he's yelling out his motivational speeches, "You need to feel invincible, powerful. Where your focus goes, your energy flows. Are you hearing me?" And while this track is not as catchy as When a Fire Starts to Burn, I do think it has more progression and instrumental texture. The beat has a lot more density and flavor with all those old school house cowbells and tons of layers of various other percussion sounds. And those stabbing synth chords that come in later, they really take it to another level, as Thomas says right as they come in. Now, another thing about this album's second half that seems to have weirded people out is that there's two low-key interludes, tracks that just barely break 2 minutes, and people were like, what are these doing here? We didn't need a break from the grooves of before, we wanted them to keep going. Personally, though, I really like the inclusion of these interludes. They feel less like a device to give the audience a break, which would in fact be unnecessary, and more like they are trying to give the album a bit more dimensionality and flavor. It's two kinda weird sounding sample-based tracks that don't really sound like anything else here, and given the more sample-based stuff these guys do tends to resonate more with me than the stuff that relies on just the regular guest features, I was all for their inclusion. The wonky beats, moody synth blips, and chopped up old-timey chorus vocals on Fractal, and the smooth 70s soul of Thinking About You, which almost had like a vaporwave-y quality to it. Never really heard these guys do stuff quite like this before. I thought both were pretty compelling little ideas that made for some refreshing detours. As for the remaining 3 tracks, they are all very much on the more low-key side, but all are interesting and compelling in their own ways. Ce n'est pas with Blick Bassy, sorry. That's a track I went back and forth with a lot. On one hand, it happens to be the longest track here at just under 6 minutes, and is generally pretty minimalistic and repetitive. The closest any track on here comes to dragging. But I do still think it's pretty texturally interesting. The sparse beats and Bassy's moaning, presumably French vocals, do create this eerie sense of space and like a mysterious atmosphere. And the track also does have 2 pretty clear halves, with its second half getting much more repetitive, but also forming a better groove and picking up more momentum. Ce n'est pas pour nous, ce n'est pas pour nous. Still very nice stuff. Then the final 2 tracks are pretty low-key as well. Birthday with Kalani and Sid. Nice, smooth, sensual, cute little track about wanting to call up your ex and check in on them. I didn't care for this one at first either, but it was another big grower. With every listen, the core tune underneath just really held up as strong in creating some intimate atmosphere. And then Reverie with Common is basically another interlude, as acting as the album's outro or something. But it's also nice and smooth and thoughtful and chill. I mean, Common's not really saying anything of interest, but he does sound really nice over this watery instrumental. Getting some feel-good bars in there, I guess. It's not exactly like a climactic, help me lose my mind level ending here. It is kind of, happens a bit quickly, but it's certainly a serviceable ending. So, that's Energy, and I really freaking enjoyed it from front to back. I do definitely have my issues with the way it comes together as a whole, and I would totally get it if you were let down by this one. Even if there's no tracks here I don't enjoy to some degree, something about the way like it's sequenced and paced makes it feel weirdly incomplete. Like I'm only getting the last 2/3 of an album, even if 43 minutes looks like a perfectly reasonable length. Not to mention, the 11 tracks here really do not come together as a cohesive whole at all. I mean, for what it's worth, even if you did take my idea of putting the Ecstasy EP in front of it and remedy the pacing issues, it'd still be a very stylistically scattershot project. I think it would be eclectic and varied in such a way that would demonstrate how many different strengths these guys have and rise above in that way, but purely in terms of cohesiveness, Settle would still beat it out. That album definitely has much more of a unified vibe and feels more like a complete whole and much better thought out. Energy did not really pull that off. I still think these guys have the potential to make an absolutely incredible dance album. Settle was not it, even if it showed they probably could do it at some point. Caracol was definitely not it. And Energy is not it either, though I feel like they're getting there. These guys definitely have a well-formed identity and style. They are really versatile and really creative. They bring in really interesting guest features, and damn if they didn't have the jams to back themselves up on this one as well. I think if they were to focus an entire album on their more sample-based stuff, like on the Moonlight and Ecstasy EPs, they could still have some guest features, but make sure they don't sacrifice extra texture for their presence. I think the final result of that would be amazing. But all that aside, what we got here was still really freaking good. For all my issues with it, this is a project I really enjoyed coming back to over and over. It's not worn out with repeat listens, and I'm sure I'll continue coming back to it for plenty more repeat listens for the rest of 2020. These guys are getting closer and closer to realizing their full potential, and I personally cannot wait for them to finally get there. Just a little more work is needed. The standard edition of Energy gets a very strong 7.7 out of 10. If you attach the Ecstasy EP to the beginning, raise it to 8.5. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.